couple of weeks ago, we received a question about slavery in that Old Testament nation of Israel and the fact that God had made laws that permitted slavery. And so I've been meaning to get this video out to give you a little context and background to the whole matter of slavery as it existed in the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. And the first thing that I really want to emphasize is that I'm only talking about slavery as it existed in that nation of Israel in the Old Testament. Throughout history, in different places and at different times, slavery has existed in a lot of different forms. And so what I'm going to say today in this video really only applies to that nation of Israel and to the laws that God gave to them during their existence in the Old Testament. One of the things that as 21st century Americans we need to recognize when we approach a topic like slavery is that we tend to come at it with a certain amount of baggage from our own experiences and our own culture. For instance, as 21st century Americans, one of the cardinal virtues that we view is the virtue of freedom. And so anything that would limit or eliminate freedom is something that we view as being bad or wrong. And slavery, because it does just that, it takes away freedoms, we tend to view it as a very, very negative and evil thing, in fact. Another thing that colors our view of slavery as Americans is the experience that our own nation had with slavery from its founding to the Civil War. And so when Americans tend to think of slavery, we tend to picture people who are in chains, who are forcibly taken from their homes in a different continent entirely and forced to work under very difficult and often brutal conditions. And so we have that view of slavery, and we need to recognize that slavery as it existed in the Old Testament nation of Israel was a very different animal than the slavery that existed here in the United States. And so we want to recognize what was slavery in that nation of Israel like. The first thing we should recognize about it is that it was limited in scope. It was a fairly rare thing. In fact, there were only three ways that a person really ended up in slavery in that Old Testament nation of Israel. One was if you were conquered in an offensive war of conquest by that nation of Israel. Second was sometimes slaves would be acquired through slave traders from other nations. And third, if somebody became poor and to cancel out their debts, sold themselves into slavery. And because those were really the three main sources for slaves, and because of the way that the history of that nation of Israel unfolded, slavery was pretty rare. It was a pretty minor and small amount of that nation of Israel. Second, slavery tended to be rather limited in duration. In fact, God in his laws in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy laid out that Hebrew slaves could only remain slaves for 6 years, and then they were to be set free in the 7th year. And so that slavery was limited in duration for just a set period of time. Now, in addition to slavery being limited in scope and limited in duration, there were also quite a number of laws that governed the way that slaves were treated. Slaves in the nation of Israel had a certain amount of what we might call religious freedom. In fact, it was the responsibility of Jewish slave owners to make sure that male slaves born into their house were circumcised. It was their responsibility to make sure that the slaves in their household were able to celebrate the great religious festivals of the nation of Israel. Those slaves were in many ways treated as equals with Israelite and part of the Israelite spiritual community. And so in a certain sense, they had a lot of religious freedoms, we might say. Those slaves also had a certain amount of protection under the law code that God gave to Moses, and it's spelled out in the books of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. In those books, we find that slaves had certain protections from abuses. In fact, if a master would unjustly treat his slave and cause certain injuries, then that slave would be able to go free. And when slaves were set free, God also commanded that masters were to provide for their physical needs so that those slaves would not end up in poverty themselves and have to sell themselves back into slavery. At least that was the intention and the hope of some of the laws God gave about how slaves were to be treated when they were released. And so as we kind of look at the way that slaves were dealt with, it was a very humane system. In fact, in many ways, slavery as God regulated it in the Old Testament nation of Israel was probably in many ways a lot closer to the employee-employer relationship of today than the slave-master relationship of early 1800s America. Those slaves in ancient Israel were protected and they were to be treated in a very humane fashion. You might think of how workers today enjoy a lot of protections from the law, and the slaves in Israelite society enjoyed a lot of protections also. In fact, I think one of the most telling features of the humanitarian nature of slavery in ancient Israel is the fact that early on in the book of Exodus, in chapter, I believe it's chapter 21, one of the very first laws that God gives in regard to slaves is he gives a law to provide for a scenario where you have someone who becomes a slave, who's an Israelite who becomes a slave, and he's supposed to be set free at the end of those 6 years in his 7th year of service. And he ends up saying, I want to remain a slave. I like my master. I appreciate the way he takes care of me. I want to remain in this situation. And God actually provides a mechanism for somebody to remain in slavery. And that may sound totally foreign to our way of thinking. We can't probably imagine somebody wanting to remain a slave. And yet, because of the way that God regulated slavery, it was actually a possibility and a reality that people would want to remain in that institution because it was to be practiced in such a humane way. And so as you think about slavery, just kind of recognize in the Old Testament, it wasn't quite the negative thing that we would think it to be. And a big part of the reason for that was the laws that God gave that regulated slavery. And so far from looking at them as some kind of harsh imposition by God that, boy, he let slavery happen. How could he do something like that? That's pretty heartless. We rather ought to recognize by stepping in and providing those laws, God regulated slavery in such a way that rather than having the negatives we associate with it, it was actually a thing that was, I don't know if I'd say positive, but certainly wasn't the negative thing that we have experienced in the history of our own nation. So that's all for slavery. Hope that gave you a little bit of background and information on that issue.